Mike Pezzullo, welcome to 7:30.
Hello, Sarah. Great to be with you.
Do you accept that you made dreadful errors of judgment that brought your public service career to an end?
Yes, I made mistakes and I need to own those mistakes and I need to learn from them. I let people down, people that I cared about in terms of who I worked with, and I regret to not be able to continue to work with them. And I certainly accept the finding that no matter how much rough and tumble there is in a place like Canberra, that the gaining of influence and the personal advantage to be gained by way of certain channels of communication, whether it's to the Prime Minister or anyone else, crosses a line in terms of conduct. I accept that and I've paid a price.
Now, the Public Service Commissioner used that language. She said you used your duty, power, status or authority to seek to gain a benefit or advantage for yourself. Can you explain what that means exactly?
Well, in terms of the contention that was put to me and what initially I sought to rebut in pretty strident terms was that by having such contact, you were going around your peers, you were finding ways to gain influence to pursue your department's agenda, whether on policy questions, on questions of resources and budget and the like. I consider myself to be, consider myself then and still consider myself to be frank and fearless and quite open. But a line was crossed in terms of not using established processes to pursue those agendas, whether those agendas related to policy, program, resources or other benefits, and I paid a price.
She also said you failed to maintain confidentiality of sensitive government information. What sensitive government information was that?
Well, as was put to me, discussions that I was privileged to be party to in terms of discussions amongst ministers or my fellow secretaries should not have been canvassed with a third party, and I accept that.
You said just now that you rebutted some of what was said. What did you reject in the allegations levelled against you?
I accepted at the time that there had been conduct that fell short of the appropriate standards. What I sought to rebut was that they were of such a grievous kind that they warranted a dismissal. It's something obviously that you don't want your career to end on that note. I put an alternative view that perhaps an appropriate censure or reprimand would have been relevant or appropriate in the circumstances. Ms Briggs, who was the Public Service Commissioner's delegate, who was scrupulously fair, very gracious in her engagement, had consideration to all of the points of rebuttal that I made, and in the end came to the determinations that she did, and she did so very fairly.
But you don't think you should have been sacked?
I think a case could be made for, in the rough and tumble of places like Canberra. It's no different from Washington or London or any other political capital. There are networks, there are people pursuing particular agendas, whether they're policy agendas, bureaucratic agendas, resource agendas, and I think that behaviour can be dealt with in other ways, but in the end it wasn't the view of the delegate, who I respect. She's a former senior public servant and a colleague. I respect her view and her judgment.
Let me just go back so I'm clear that I understand you. Are you saying that essentially everybody's doing it, you got caught because you wrote it down?
No, I'm not saying that at all, and I'm not going to use the defence of everyone else is doing it, so therefore it's okay. I think
you did suggest in the rough and tumble of politics, which suggests it is a little bit more widespread. Was your crime to get caught writing it down?
No. I just to be clear, not at all. It was more than just simply being caught. It was the extent of using a third party back channel that I've come to accept was wrong.
Let me just ask you about that. So on the one hand, you're seen lobbying against Moderate Defence Minister Marise Payne. Marise is a problem, you say, completely ineffectual. On the other hand, you're boosting the Conservative former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, saying any chance of being able to rehabilitate Abbott. Do you accept that makes you sound like a schemer with an ideological agenda?
I'm not sure that it was ideological. It was more about achieving outcomes, but it was a mistake to put messages in those terms and to even have that conversation, and I've paid the price.
How many senior public servants do you think would survive scrutiny of their private conversations?
I have no idea, but in my case, I've reflected on the circumstances of my departure. It's something that I regret. I made a mistake. I'm moving on. I want to focus on making a positive contribution to our national security, but in a very different way now.
Just before we go to there, I just want to understand what you saw as the advantage you were seeking to gain.
The advantage either in terms of achieving a program outcome or a policy outcome or a particular outcome in terms of resourcing the department. It was considered in terms of the finding that I was using channels outside of the established mechanisms to pursue those ends. I accept that. I made a mistake.
But wasn't there also a political element to this, that you wanted a certain type of political leader in the ministerial positions that you considered to be important to you?
I wouldn't use the term political in the sense that I think you're getting at, Sarah. It was more about people with an aptitude or an orientation towards particular outcomes, whether they're in the Labor Party or the Liberal Party, that were of interest to me. And I should have kept those thoughts to myself. So
it's not a political distinction between Marise Payne and Tony Abbott that you were trying to make?
No. I've got high regard for the former Foreign Minister and the former Defence Minister, and it's not commentary that I should have made.
So when you called her completely ineffectual, what were you saying?
Well, in terms of the circumstances of that message, it's been retailed. The context has been retailed. If I had that view about her, I should have kept it to myself.
Let's move on to the question of Australia's defence strategy, and particularly looking at what was published last week and announced last week by Richard Marles. He's describing a rising risk of conflict in the Indo-Pacific. Most people can't imagine what a war with China would look like. You have imagined it. What vulnerabilities would we be exposed to in Australia?
I think just very briefly and summarily, before I get quite to the point of the question, the context in which such a circumstance would arise, I just want to make clear, because I don't want to speak irresponsibly. I think the likelihood of this occurring is actually quite low. The consequences would be significant and indeed catastrophic. But at the moment, the chances of this occurring, I put in a recent address, the one that you mentioned off the top, at about 10%. The likelihood of conflict in this decade being about 10%, which is certainly meaningful. It's meaningful enough to plan for and indeed to be concerned about, but not so high as to be, if you like, traumatised by. We've got agency. We can get that number down, in fact. So I just want to make that point from the outset. And you get that number down by way of good, effective diplomacy in the first instance, coupled with showing resolve. And perhaps we can talk about the measures by which we might show resolve. But in terms of the impact on Australia, it seems to me they resolve to three different areas. One would be cyber. Critical infrastructure particularly would be vulnerable. You've had FBI Director Wray in recent times talking about quite explicitly the intelligence that he sees and the assessment and the judgment he's come to, that there is malware implanted on both US and allied networks, which is specifically designed to be activated in the lead up to or at the outset of a conflict. And Director Wray has talked about the low blows that would be visited on the population at large, taking down hospitals, electricity grids and the like. So I think that's one.
To be clear about that,
please.
Would you anticipate that Australia's undersea cables that deliver internet to Australia would be cut?
Well, possibly. I don't particularly want to go into specific scenarios, except insofar as they're referable to think tanks and other open source publications that your viewers can further inform themselves about. But that certainly would be one vulnerability. But there'd be other vulnerabilities that Director Wray and others have spoken about. Another area of vulnerability would be cognitive warfare. It's a very defence or strategist technical term, but cognitive warfare is basically warfare over attitude, warfare over will, and warfare over perceptions, particularly using technology-enabled AI-driven deepfakes, disinformation, propaganda and the like, essentially for two purposes. One is to undermine the war effort cognitively, in other words, to demoralise the population and get the population into a circumstance where they're either resisting the war effort itself or at least being reluctantly involved in it. So that's cognitive warfare. And the Chinese doctrine itself talks about the use of cognitive weapons as part of their multi-pronged approach. And then, of course, in the most dire of circumstances, we just need to look at unclassified publications that have got weapons ranges plotted against and flying times plotted against the Australian mainland. So there could be, in extremis, very low probability of this occurring. Indeed, I would say at the moment it's unlikely to occur, but potentially you could be looking at what are called kinetic strikes onto the Australian territory, particularly targeted at key facilities.
Let me ask you this. So Australia is building its missile and, as we know, submarine capacity as quickly as it can. But how exposed would we be were there to be a conflict that occurred before or around 2030?
Well, point one, Sarah, is I don't want to help design an adversary strategy for them, so they can work out those issues for themselves. The direction of travel is the right direction to shore up those vulnerabilities as quickly as we can. But more particularly, what will help reduce vulnerability, Sarah, is something that's going on quietly and effectively in the Indo-Pacific. What you're now seeing are very different strategic geometries emerge, the US, Japan and Australia, for instance, the US, Japan and the Philippines, for instance, Australia, the Philippines and the US. And that will complicate an adversary's calculations about whether, in fact, it would suit them or indeed benefit them to strike. And indeed, they might have to recalculate whether using more kinetic options, such as military attack, actually is worthwhile. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of years actually has complicated the Chinese calculus rather than simplified it.
I mentioned at the beginning in the intro that you were the lead author, you were the lead author on that paper in 2009. It's a long time ago now. How vulnerable have we made Australia by failing to secure a submarine fleet in time?
Well, I said recently that it's to be regretted that as a national endeavour, that the plan that was announced by the Rudd government in 2009, noting that other factors came in to intervene, other budget priorities, the fallout from the global financial crisis, all of that's understood, but it's to be regretted that 12 larger conventional submarines were not proceeded with, because as I've said recently, you made mention of some comments I've made on a podcast and to a think tank, in a speech to a think tank. That would have given us a viable stepping stone to a nuclear capability, the kind of nuclear capability that now is available to us, or going to be available to us through AUKUS Pillar 1. It would have allowed us, having doubled the fleet, to have more submarines out there in particular choke points and in particular areas of operation. And I've said publicly, and I'll say it to your viewers, that it's to be regretted that that plan from 2009 was modified and not proceeded with.
You obviously feel, Mike Pezzullo, that you still have a lot to contribute. How much have you sacrificed by falling to the temptation to become a political player?
I'm going to sidestep the premise in the very end of your question, but we can debate that if you wish. I didn't see myself doing that, but I can come back to that. I regret the mistake I made. It's meant that I'm not at the table assisting in these deliberations. But Sarah, I just take the view that the universe has got a plan for us all, and in that plan, it was to be my destiny or to be my future, to do something different. The one regret I have out of all of that is leaving behind the people, my peers, senior leaders who I worked with, and those young up-and-coming Australians in more junior positions of authority who one day will be the leaders, who just do astonishing work that can hardly be spoken about, but I know what they do and I very much value their work, as should your viewers.
Whether or not there was a plan, you still had free will. If it wasn't for political influence, what were those messages about?
Well, let's perhaps agree to split the difference. I'll call it bureaucratic influence. Political influence in my thinking relates to things like pre-selections and which political party should win the next election. I'm completely neutral and agnostic on that. I continue to be. I want to be, to the extent that I'm contributing to a public debate, seen as objective, fair-minded, and able to see the good on both sides of the aisle in terms of policies, for instance. Whereas bureaucratic power, which is what I would contend to you was in scope of those discussions, should have been pursued through other channels.
Mike Pezzullo, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.